Hey guys, this is Art. Thanks so much for coming to my patio. We're smoking another cigar out here. This one's the Habano Clasico, another El Cheapo cigar. This cigar right here is another one of those cheap but good cigars. This is what's considered a Cuban sandwich. It's just made out of all the leftovers after they're done rolling the much more expensive stuff. They have a bunch of tobacco left over, and so they just kind of mix and match, whatever they have left over and roll this. Basically, it's just the shake of the tobacco. Doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. There are some really bad quality ones. This one's not too bad. Very first question that gets asked when you start smoking cigars is, what's the deal with Cuban cigars? Have you smoked one? Is it good? Is it better? Is it the best cigar ever? Cuba is actually right in the middle of what's considered a tropic cancer, which actually makes it ideal for growing tobacco. Temperature wise, humidity wise, it's just one of the best places to actually grow tobacco. But here's the nasty history behind Cuba and tobacco growing in the history. So the tobacco plant actually originated in South America. This guy, King Philip V, actually monopolized tobacco growing in Cuba in about 1717, around there. It lasted until 1870, damn, 100 years after Fidel Castro overthrew Batista in Cuba. Eisenhower, at the time our president, actually made plans to then go in there and overthrow Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, I guess, got wind of what was going on, started buying guns from the Soviet Union. Now that made the US really upset. Definitely a no-no for the US. So the US decides they're gonna stop buying as much sugar from Cuba. Obviously, financially, that hurts Cuba a lot, especially coming out of a war. The Soviet Union says, hey, we'll buy the sugar from you guys. Obviously, that makes the US really upset. So they stopped exporting gas to Cuba. All the US-based oil companies in Cuba refused to refine any kind of gas and oil for Cuba. Even though they're on Cuban land, they refuse because technically they're US companies. Cuba decides to what's called nationalize these US oil companies. Basically, they just took over them and made them part of Cuba. They didn't pay anyone for them, no subsidies, nothing. This made a lot of people cheesed, especially all the US owners and the US people who had money invested in the oil companies in Cuba. So in 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion happened, approved by President Kennedy, funded by the CIA, going in there to overthrow the Fidel administration, which failed. Fidel and his troops actually defeated the US invasion in about 3 days. So that was pretty embarrassing for the US, obviously. After that, Cuba declared itself socialist and actually aligned itself with the Soviet Union. Under President Kennedy, we decided to basically start the complete embargo, which basically means we completely cut off Cuba. But not before Kennedy decides to send this guy out to Cuba to get a lot of his favorite Cuban cigars and bring them back to him. Smart man, if you ask me. Anyways, Cuban cigar makers became forbidden fruit and lost the biggest market they had, which was the US market. A lot of Cuban cigar makers actually moved to different countries to look for different lands like Mexico or Nicaragua or the DR, because they couldn't do any business in Cuba. Cubans were met with shortages of fuel, whole run of bad weather in Cuba. They were experimenting with hybrid seeds, which failed in Cuba. The consistency and the quality of Cuban cigars really plummeted. Around that time, we also had the missile crisis, 13-day standoff between the Soviet Union and the US. The US found out that the Soviet Union was stashing missiles in Cuba. The missile crisis is considered the closest we ever came to all-out nuclear war. In around 2000s, Bill Clinton, our president at the time, actually signed a sanction to actually relax ties with Cuba and start trading with them a little bit more. Way to go, Bill Clinton. The exclusivity and the illegalness really what made the Cuban cigar popular all those years. That, coupled with in the movies, they made it super cool. A lot of the best Cuban cigar makers had actually gone to other countries and had started growing other type of seeds and had kind of upped their game as well. Today, of course, you are 100% able to go to Cuba, buy cigars, bring them back. It's not as coveted as it was before. You can actually just go out and buy one. There are a lot of fakes out there, so definitely watch out for that if you guys are planning. But definitely try and buy from reputable seller cigars and made in Cuba and non-Cuban cigars. Which is the best. That's something that you and your friends are gonna have to decide. So grab a couple cigars, grab a couple friends, light them up, and let me know what you guys think. Let me know in the comments. Thanks again for watching, guys. You guys have a great one.